Hi, everyone. As folks are still joining, I'll just get us started. Good afternoon. Thank you for attending. My name's Dee Logan, and I'm a project manager at the Learning and Working During the Transitions to Adulthood Rehabilitation and Research Training Center here at UMass Chan Medical School. Again, I want to thank you for joining us for our webinar today, Transforming Community Mental Health Care, How to Grow the Youth and Young Adult Peer Support Workforce with Antonia, Barba, Michelle Munson, and Vanessa Klodnick. Before I turn it over to Antonia, I wanted to thank them, all of them, for presenting and thank the Learning and Working RRTC's funder. This webinar is made possible with funding from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, also known as NIDILRR, under grant number 90RTE-M005. And now I'll just quickly go over some Zoom housekeeping items. This is a Zoom webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website. You can use the Q&A button to send questions to the presenters during the webinar, and we'll also have a Q&A session after they've finished the presentation. They're hoping for participation, so please feel free to shoot your questions to them live when they're talking. Live captions are being auto-generated by Zoom. The icons to enable them are in the control panel at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please note that participants are automatically muted with webcams off. If you have any problems, please feel free to email me at deirdre.logan@umassmed.edu, or you can send us messages through Q&A as well. And with that, I'm now going to turn it over to our presenters. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's really awesome to be here with you today. My name is Antonia Barba. I use she, her pronouns. I am a clinical social worker. I have done a lot of things during my time in the field. I've been a hotline counselor, an HIV test counselor. I've been a trauma therapist and a trainer in all kinds of things with mental health professionals. And I'm bringing that expertise and experience with me along today, as well as talking a lot about my role with the Bridging the Gap program as a program developer and program director. And so before kind of handing things over to my colleagues to introduce themselves, I'll say very quickly, we come together around this particular project, this program called Bridging the Gap. And I actually realized in preparing for this, we've been working together for 5 to 6 years. So this is a long history of work and collaboration. And just to give you a very quick snapshot of the program that we're here to talk about, the lens that we're going to be presenting through. Bridging the Gap was a program at the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services, a large mental health service agency in New York. And it was funded by a 5-year SAMHSA grant through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that focused on a range of trauma treatment and services for adolescents, teens, and young adults, with a focus on specialized support and really expanding the range of treatment and service options to be more inclusive of the needs of LGBTQ+ youth, especially LGBTQ+ youth at risk of homelessness, who had systems involvement, as well as youth who'd been commercially sexually exploited or trafficked. And a big part of the program was developing and integrating a range of young adult peer mentorship services and a menu of services that were youth-centered and youth-focused. And that was the first time we'd had anything of that kind in our agency. And so one of the first people that I met in the program was Dr. Michelle Munson, and she was our project evaluator for the entire 5-year life of the grant, which I recognize is a really amazing thing to have that continuity. We joined forces with her very early at the beginning. And she just seamlessly opened her arms to our program, seamlessly integrated our peer mentorship team, and really guided and helped us to pace. And so now I'll turn things over to her to introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Antonia, thank you for that introduction. I'm so glad to be here and share space with you, of course, and reflect on our journey with Bridging the Gap, and also with Vanessa, who I've had a great opportunity to work with in a number of different spaces related to community mental health, and specifically related to youth and young adult peer support. And I'm just going to say I've learned so much from them. I think part of the richness of our collaboration has really been a back and forth, which is what I think we hope to continue on in this webinar. I also want to share a little bit about my positionality. I use she, her pronouns as well, and a little bit about my positionality as it relates to this body of work. So I also identify as a social worker. I spent a decade as a youth worker, really an outreach worker in the sort of typical positive youth development kind of space, running different programs. And then I worked in clinical social work, actually in New York City, in the borough of Queens, in psychiatry. And I also identify as a social work professor, and teaching is a very big part of my identity, and a social work researcher who has embedded peer support, as Antonia said, in this project, but in other projects as well. And lastly, before I turn it over to Vanessa, I also identify as a person with lived experience myself. And that's a very important part of my positionality as it relates to the work we're talking about today. So welcome again, and pass the mic to you, Vanessa.
Oh, this is so wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves in the chat. My name is Vanessa Voorhees Klodnick. I also go by she, her, hers pronouns, and I come to this work wearing many hats and learning so much through doing the work. For about the last 15 years, I have been working in some capacity to figure out how to integrate youth voice, youth perspectives into community mental health programming for young people transitioning to adulthood. And this peer work is so fun. It is so complicated, so complex, and I'm so excited to have the opportunity to create this space for all of us to engage in what I hope is a conversation. And so we are going to have a hot chat box. I want you all to get to know each other. We have lots of people from across the country chiming in. Introduce yourself. We're going to have some questions throughout. And so I really want you to not just like listen to us and sit back, but engage with us, engage with other people across the country who are, language is important. I'm going to say wrestling with this work and growing through doing it. So I'm just really excited to be here today. Thank you. And Michelle and Antonia, I have grown so much with y'all, and I just am so thankful to be in this space and share some of our lessons learned. And so with that, I'm going to toss it back over to Michelle.
Okay, next slide. Yeah, so I think one of the most important things that we wanted to make sure we start out with is really an opportunity to explicitly put into the space that we, all three of us, really believe there is no one right way to do peer work. We are not here to tell people, how to do this. We're really here to digest, think about, and explore the many different ways that we can successfully embed youth and young adult peer support. We're here to share our perspectives. We've all been involved in leading youth and young adult programs. And so we just want to make sure to say that from the beginning, that there's many paths, and we really feel that we need, all hands on deck here. This work is growing and getting more support, but there's really not one way to do this well. And then if you forward also, I think our goal, right, in doing that is that we really want to share our observations from being engaged in this work as program directors, as evaluators, in our many hats, and share our observations and also tools. So together, the three of us have evolved a set of tools that we're going to also share throughout the webinar. And we want to share some of the challenges that young people have faced in this work, and also share some of what we think has worked well. So yeah, just a disclaimer.
Thank you, Michelle. So I wanted to get us started out with an Indigenous peoples acknowledgement. And as we have everyone chiming in from across the country, it's really important that we take a step back and recognize our native lands and the people who came before us. And both across Michelle, Antonia, and I, we do work across the country, but here are some of the states that we do predominantly a lot of our work in. Whoop, whoop, Massachusetts and Texas. We got lots of participants on my end coming in. Very, very cool to see y'all. But I highly suggest that you check out this beautiful Canadian website and learn about the Indigenous people that lived on the lands much before us, and that, you know, we're doing incredible work today. We have a lot of work to do, but we really need to recognize our history. So please take a moment. You can use that QR code and check out that incredible website. Slide. So our objectives today, and I love the disclaimer, Michelle, so incredibly helpful. We really want to dig in a little bit of the history of youth and young adult peer support and the key principles that are drawing from both youth and adult community mental health. We also are going to spend the bulk of our time wrestling with some of the tensions, the real world tensions that are happening in community mental health settings that are impacting, I'm going to say, young people in peer roles. And we'll leave it at that because we're going to dig into it. And then also, we are going to highlight some current best practices that are both emerging and established, and some publicly available free resources that y'all will be able to access right during this webinar. Next slide. Okay, so this, I get asked this a lot. What is peer support, just in general? That's just like the question. What is it? What do they do? What do they do? It's like, oh my gosh. So this is like a very rudimentary slide. Yes, Antonia, you can highlight that green box over there. And this is an oldie but a goodie, and this is not perfect. So again, disclaimer, but just a way to explain this to people, because a lot of us are advocates. Probably everyone on this webinar is an advocate for youth and young adult peer support and voice and perspective in leadership in our community mental health settings. But this idea that we've got this side, this adult professional provider side, they're very well intentioned. They are well trained in their evidence-based practices with a lot of science behind it and literature and articles. There's an embedded hierarchy. The medical model has a hierarchy. It's how we pay for services in most settings. Not all, I want to be clear, but most. We have to be doing something that's based on medical necessity, and that is defined based on whatever state you're in. Will be different, but you're going to have people that are billing different service lines for different amounts of money, and there's a hierarchy. And also, this is something that's a flaw that I'm running into a lot now as I'm getting older, is I'm making false assumptions that I know what it's like to be in my transition to adulthood. It's different today. It's different every day with technology and change happening. It is fundamentally different to be someone who is transitioning to adulthood now than 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so although many adult professional providers mean well and can relate, and they do relate in some ways, they really haven't been there. So then on the youth side, this is really important. You click again, Antonia, for me, is just this idea that young people are struggling. Now, the transition to adulthood is so difficult for most young people. Just that. Then you layer on serious mental health diagnosis and all that goes with that. And so struggling with work and school and relationships and housing and just where do I fit? Who am I? Right? So young people are figuring out who they are. That is what it means to transition to adulthood. Right? So this idea of and then the medical model folks, the professional is like, you need to integrate mental illness into your identity. You need to have insight. My God, that word, it's just such a word. You need to know and you need to embrace this as part of you. Yes, and many young people, at least have said to me in my research and in my practice, yeah, no, no, I don't know, or a piece of that maybe fits, but not all of it. And then in all of our, my God, so many colleagues and so many people who have joined us today, see all these people joining. Our research says that young people are feeling very misunderstood in our services, and in fact, not feeling very respected, not feeling a lot of trust with those professional providers. And then also feeling out of place, like is this for me? I don't feel like these providers are speaking my language. I feel like they're asking me questions that don't align with why I'm here. And then often I'm bringing, as a young person, a bunch of strengths that are not being acknowledged. But at the end of the day, Our community mental health settings are in a medical model. They're privileging deficit model assessment. What's wrong? We need to fix what's wrong. We're not necessarily looking at, wow, what are you good at first? And then through doing that, we're going to figure out what are you struggling with and how we can help. Just not how things are set up right now. Might be very different in 10 years or 15 years, fingers crossed. So here's where peer support comes in. You click again, Antonia. So you've got this medical model professional person that means well and maybe a wonderful person. You got a young person being like, this is all overwhelming. And then you have this, and forgive this, again, not perfect, but a surfer coming in, whooshing in, is more on your level, is going through the tumultuous sea, the waves, like gets it, and is like, I get you. And it's that. And I don't know how to capture that. And actually, will you go, next slide, Antonia, for me, is this idea. And I actually want to throw this out to the chat. And I love that y'all are bringing this. I want people to actually answer a chat question. So if we pause for 1 second, I want you guys to think about, what does peer mean? What is peer? How do you define peer? Because this is one of the most tricky false assumptions of the work that we do, that peer is one static, definable key thing that you can capture and hold on to. And so I want you, in your experience, in your role, throw in the chat, what is peer? Because there's tensions between the adult side of community mental health and the adult peer support world and the youth and young adults, your mentor world. So there's these two amazing systems. Well, my gosh, everything, I mean, social systems are complicated, but that they both have different ideas of this. And the work we're talking about today is where they meet. And that now we've had to create a new sense of, what is peer? What does peer mean? And also, what is support, right? What is that? And what does that look like? All right, keep them coming, folks, in the chat. Next slide, Antonia. So as we move into this, I just thought it would be important to talk a little bit about what's coming from the adult community mental health. I'm going to say philosophy and practice in peer support, and what is coming from the youth, young adult side. And they meet, they sometimes conflict, but they sometimes overlap, and it looks different in different places. So again, this disclaimer. What I can see that I see across the country in our work together is that mutuality is a piece of this. And a lot of people are like, what is that? And it looks different in different places. But this idea of mutuality, at the base of it, is that there isn't a power differential there, that two people are helping each other mutually. They're mutually benefiting. They're mutually supporting. And that takes a lot of forms. And I will cheesily use these notions of co-creating, co-caring, co-sharing. Looks different in different places. But this idea of mutuality, it's woven through youth mentor programs and adult peer support. Also, this notion of respect and shared responsibility, this is at like the root of peer support, is this notion that like we have mutual respect for each other, the person seeking support and also the support provider, that's really, it's at the crux. It has to be there for peer support to exist. And that it's not just the responsibility of the peer provider to provide the service and the participant or the client or the patient to accept the service or engage in the service, like all that transactional stuff, forget all that. It's about the shared togetherness of doing the work that produces the healing and the wellness. There's also this connection thing. Often when I'm asked, like, what is peer support? And I'm like wrestling, I'm like, I don't know. It's this deep, kind of hard to capture connection. Sometimes people use the term bond. That can be a little problematic in some spaces. But it's like this deep sense of feeling like validation, understanding, and belonging, especially with youth. I'll say that transition to adult population, like feeling like I belong with this person. This person gets me, they feel me. I feel brave, I feel supported, I feel safe, like all that. And I also want to throw out this idea of like community, like feeling deep community with your providers. If you're in a place that's peer run, a center or a provider, an agency that's peer run, you just feel like you're part of a community and everyone is part of it. And I can't describe and capture what that is. And I highly suggest, if you haven't been to a fully peer run agency before, go visit one. You will feel this upon arrival and you'll be like, I want this, I need more of this. Okay. Mentoring, guidance, role modeling. These are really coming from the youth peer world. And I want to say something about navigation. Peer navigators are hot. They're popping up all over healthcare, including mental health care, community mental health care. This idea that the peer role helps one navigate systems, figuring out the right language to use to get one's needs met and to be heard, really, really powerful. And I'm going to say incredibly important. This advocacy piece of peer support is woven throughout youth and adult practice. Strategic use of self and authenticity, we're going to dig into this in a minute, but I just want to say that it's so much more than sharing your story. It is how you show up to work every day and who you are and how authentic you can be and how you can use your lived and living experience. And then nothing about us without us. This is something that I challenge all the decision makers on this call. We all are decision makers. Actually, we make like 25,000 decisions a day. If you really think about it, it's wild. Some neuroscience people told me that once. But this idea that nothing about us without us. We cannot be making decisions about care, about program design without not just collaborating, but deeply involving and sharing the decision making with people who are service participants. And then finally, what is I will say the most important from my perspective, again, disclaimer, my perspective, is that young people in peer roles and adults in peer roles have to commit to deep self-reflection and a willingness to grow. Because if you're using yourself every day in your work, you have to be willing to self-reflect and figure out, gosh, who am I? What do I think about this? How am I going to help someone? How do I even share that about myself? Have to be willing to develop deep, deep self-knowledge and self-awareness. Next slide. Okay, I wanted to share my Massachusetts young adult peer mentor folks out there. We love you. I want to introduce people across the country to an incredible resource. This is the working definition of the young adult peer mentor practice model in Massachusetts. And I just want to read it to you. It's really powerful. It's simple but complex. Youth peers provide a unique and valuable perspective and support through which young people often feel more connected, less alone, more willing to open up and try new skills with someone who is not in a position of power over them, but who walks alongside them and supports their self-determination and goals. This idea of walking with and doing with, feeling with, very, very, very critical. I highly suggest checking out the Children's Behavioral Health Knowledge Center website and looking into the peer practice profiles. There are 6 core elements. They will help to unpack these very complex ideas of how do you walk with someone. Next slide. And finally, hey, Kim Bissett, I know you're in here on this call. I just want to shout out to you. In training young people in peer roles, I've learned from Kim a wonderful, wonderful quote that I've added one word to. But this quote is about living experience. It is not enough for us to lean into the notion of lived experience. And I will tell you, I am hearing it so much more in powerful meetings and spaces where I hear leaders say, I have lived experience. I know what this is like. It changes the conversation. However, young people in peer roles are living their experiences right now, and we need to acknowledge that. And so to use this notion, I may not have been in your shoes, but I've been to the same shoe store recently, is really important to embrace this, that part of being a peer support provider is having deep empathy. And part of it is also recognizing I'm going through it too right now with you. We're going to get into this more today. So thank you so much. I think now we're going to pass this over to Michelle.
Thanks, Vanessa. So this kind of seamlessly, this slide builds on something that Vanessa already mentioned, which you've been putting all these amazing perspectives of what is peer in the chat. So keep them coming. But we wanted to also just make sure to talk about this and amplify that peerness indeed is much more than lived and living experience with mental illness, right? And thinking about, for example, what is your particular program or your particular initiative that you're thinking about involving and partnering with peers. And all of these other elements can be key and critical for many of those things Vanessa just so eloquently talked about, right? Connection, and mutuality, right? And so if you're thinking about evolving a program, really trying to, for example, help young people with housing or college experiences, right? There's much more to peerness than just lived experience and mental illness. There can be so much important insight and wisdom around different aspects and elements of a youth and young adult program. And then also some of these other characteristics, so important, like just interests. What do you do for fun, right? Things that are connected to relatability and mutual relatability. And that's so much of that gist of what can lead to connection and what we sometimes think about as zest and part of having this relationship that can move and change people. So all of us who are engaged in doing peer work or developing programs, I encourage us to really think about beyond, having folks with lived and living experience, what's the program goals? And what else is really important around peerness for this particular initiative? So next slide. Yeah, you can put all of it down here. Yeah, so we wanted to also talk a little bit about this, again, kind of like defining, redefining, and this tension between what kind of peers have historically been, thought to provide and have kind of come out of this movement of mutual shared relating in more of a voluntary context into now, as we mentioned a moment ago, peer navigators and peer support coming into formal mental health system and defining peers as experts and being in this expert role of the helper and helping those who are seeking or who are in need of help or who are, quote, non-experts. And we really think this is a real important tension for all of us on this call to be thinking about, right? How are we going to be defining the role of peer and expertise and credibility as we move forward in all of these different kinds of programs and initiatives? And I think this quote is really, really powerful, I think, in bringing together all of those different kinds of roles, in just emphasizing that peer support is about social change. And this quote says, being together for the purpose of being known. It is the sharing of responsibility and effort so we can enjoy the experience of being part of something bigger than ourselves. Both parts of that connection. Moving toward is being together for the purpose of being fulfilled. And I think that essence is present in peer support across that continuum. Next slide. So we also want to talk about how in youth peer roles, near age youth peer roles, we're often thinking about, and I think this is true more broadly about peer support too, that this role really is twofold, that there are these different aspects and elements of the work that's going on for many youth peers. That role, as Vanessa talked about being a supporter, right? And I think we have to think about what that means in and of itself, but providing that individual peer support to young people. But often that our youth peers are also in the role of disruptor, of somebody who can be challenging in team-based models, in models that are within organizations, right? In helping move organizations to think differently and disrupt norms, right? And so we have to be thinking about and be clear about these kinds of expectations from the jump, from putting out ads to interviewing and hiring. Also, for those of us who are program developers and designers, talking with organizations we're working with to see if they're willing to change and if they're willing to have young people embedded within their organization that want to support other young people, but potentially also push difficult conversations and disrupt some norms. So we wanted to kind of put that in the space, and we'll get more into detail with that with the Bridging the Gap program. Next slide. Another important tension, and this came up a couple of slides ago, right, is again, peer roles exist along this whole continuum, right? And again, on the right-hand side is this historical kind of advocacy change role, shared power, mutuality, often informal support. And now on that left-hand side, right, this is both a great thing, but it's bringing up a lot of questions for us, making peer support work billable and in the context of the mental health system and in youth services systems as well. And so we have to be thinking about, what does that mean? What does that mean for organizations, programs, supervisors, and peers? So we want to be thinking about this whole continuum. In fact, very, very recently, you can forward to the next slide, please. A comprehensive approach to youth peer support was published by organization that really just is putting out this notion related to the last slide, that we can be thinking about peer work along this whole continuum. In the smaller green circle, right, is kind of this idea we're talking about embedding peers into youth serving systems of care. Particularly, we're really considering behavioral health today. But then if you go further out into that orange, go where people spend their time, bringing in peers to sort of more broad-based community orgs, schools, also in the digital spaces, and beginning to think that's so important that, you know, that's where young people are going. So how are we going to begin to evolve these ideas of youth and young adult peers in virtual spaces? And then in the blue circle, more of the kind of universal prevention. Should we be thinking about, you know, training up all young people in ways to be able to be supportive peers, to be thinking about wellness, to be thinking about that in the context of their lives? So this new report just came out, and Vanessa nicely added I think, what do you call that? Something where you can click on it and get the report.
A QR code.
Thank you. I'm dating myself. That's a QR code. Okay. So next slide.
It's like one of the only good things that came out of COVID.
Okay, and then lastly, the three of us really, really wanted to talk for a moment and hopefully get some ideas going in the chat about this as well, about just the importance of thinking about this aspect of sharing lived experience and really being, you know, thoughtful about what that means within the context of your program, right? Thinking deeply with leadership, with the young peers that are part of the work that you're doing, about why, how, and for what reasons, right, are we sharing lived experience? And this continuum here of thinking about both the importance of authenticity in sharing, but also about being strategic about that, being more strategic and mindful about how we're expecting individuals to share their lived experience, something that we know, you know, we're living in the world here and stigma is alive and well. And so what is it that we are doing to make this a positive experience? Okay. And so for those of you on the call, right, whether you're a program developer, funder, you know, peer, you can perhaps put some ideas that you have about, you know, what has been done in your experience to make sharing of lived experience feel more right or more balanced for you, right? Of course, we're going to talk more about good supervision and kind of this tension about thinking about being able to kind of balance that experience, which can be challenging. And next slide. And then we wanted to all, I think, speak for a moment about the very real experience that a lot of youth and young adult peers are up against related to oppression that can manifest and show itself through ableism, ageism, right? Being a younger person working in an organization, and racism, right? And all of these things can be at play at the same time, right? Through an intersectional lens. And so I think it's important for us all to remain aware of that, and then also try to think about ways that we can be active in our roles in these spaces to be pushing against and helping young people. So I know Vanessa and Antonia were going to speak a little bit on this slide as well, because we all felt really strongly about this. And then I will pass it off to Antonia.
Yeah, before Antonia takes over for a moment, I just want to say that these were the unintended, I'll just say, challenges in supporting young people with doing a great job of doing peer support. Is these things are very real, and being willing to say that they are real in the moment. I think that anyone out there who is a peer support provider in a youth setting, or is a supervisor or program leader or a funder or state administrator who's joined us today, is to really be aware of these and to not be afraid of having those hard conversations. When you see it and you know it and you can see it happening, figuring out a way that's going to work within that setting and in that moment to address, because these are very real. And I think, you know, when I started this work 10 or 15 years ago, I wasn't as aware now, nor did I not have the voice to be able to speak up in the moment and actually, and then strategically work with people to say, hey, I think some of these systems are actually racist, and calling them what they are, and how we need to come up with solutions to correct these. And so I just want to say, you have to be willing to have the hard conversations, because these exist right now in the work that we're doing to support the youth and young adult peer workforce. And it's going to take all of us on this, in this webinar today, and for us to be leaders out in the field on calling things what they are when we see it, and figuring out ways to process that. And who do you have who is someone that you can be safe and brave with to process how you're going to communicate something that you see is ageist, ableist, or racist. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michelle and Vanessa. I just want to underscore everything that you've said about this, and just add, while I think in my experience of leading and supervising a peer program for 5 years, I saw kind of the disproportionate burden that was carried by our young adult peer staff by virtue of them holding often multiple intersecting marginalized identities and carrying a disproportionate load of this, and then seeing that translate. But what I want to say is that that's not that is true and real, and also these forms of oppression are experienced by everyone. That addressing this work, being proactive about it, being real about it, naming it, acknowledging it, validating, and not gaslighting, that benefits us all. And so a lot of this gets reflected back, and it needs to be addressed in the course of doing peer work. And also, frankly, I think this is our shared responsibility. This is all of our work, particularly those of in those areas where we hold power and privilege, right? And knowing that that moves and changes, but thinking about our spheres of influence. And so for me as a program leader, as a woman with white skin, with my credentials and all the other areas of privilege that I held, that meant a lot of questioning and introspection, and not accepting the status quo, and examining and unpacking, and doing that in collaboration. And I feel really fortunate that the agency where I was doing this work at the time that we were engaged in this had a really robust anti-racism initiative that was staff-led, that included affinity groups and spaces where people could have very real conversations and draw on support and living expertise of how to address this. And that was something that I benefited from, that my team benefited from. But again, I just want to make it really clear, it benefits us all. It benefits the organization, the systems, to make them healthier, to make them more effective in our missions. I think through the course of this project, really kind of leaned into all of the brilliance and benefits of storytelling. and kind of in thinking about how to share some of the experience and really bring to life, talking about some of the how this impacted us on an organizational level, what it was like to develop and cultivate and integrate young adult peer programming. It felt the best way to do this was through kind of some narrative storytelling. And so I want to tell a little bit, a part of the story of Bridging the Gap. So as a reminder, it was a 5-year grant-funded program. And being that it was grant funded, there's just tremendous privilege and opportunity to really advance and develop work that the agency had been interested in, had been wanting to do, had started to build some infrastructure around. Without the burden of having to bill for services, right? It's like a 5-year kind of grand experiment to develop these services and to really move in a direction that was youth-centered, developing and cultivating these peer mentorship services for what they really needed to be, for what our young folks wanted them to be, and could envision them being, for what our young adult peer staff wanted them to be, right? What they might have wanted back in the day when they were involved in services, and to really lead with young people and develop that without the pressure of having to bill for services right away. And so, this, I think from an agency, I was not a part of writing and developing the grant. I came in after the grant had been awarded and got to enact this plan. But I think, what I know is that our organization really saw this as a tremendous opportunity, right? These are things we've been wanting to do. We have these populations of young people who feel very vulnerable, where we recognize that as a field, as an agency, as programs within an agency, that the needs of these young people are really like outpacing our capacity to keep up. And that this is a really, a tremendous opportunity to integrate peer mentorship services and to connect with clients that, we recognize where we could do better, where we might be missing the mark, where they don't feel, right, all of those things that Vanessa shared around feeling a sense of belonging and connection in these programs, that this was an opportunity to really lean into this work. Right, this is so needed, right? We're going to focus on these really vulnerable client populations that we recognize we could do better. We want to do better. We're going to introduce young adult peers. They're going to partner with our clients. They're going to work together, and let's put them into the programs that are maybe having the most struggles, right? Like where they could use the extra supplemental support. These are programs that are experiencing challenges. Right, the name itself, Bridging the Gap, recognizing that there are unmet needs and wanting to take action to address and fill some of those gaps. And so what we developed was this idea that our team kind of grew to call, that we're mobile support. We were a program, a unit of folks cultivating peer mentorship services. And then we went out and partnered with programs across the Jewish board where some of these young people were already enrolled in services. We worked a lot with residential treatment centers, residential treatment facilities, group homes. So we found, and ultimately outpatient programs. And so the way that we functioned was to go into those programs and offer services and get to know the staff and the treatment teams, get to know young people, and give young people the option of how they wanted to participate with us. Did they want individual mentorship? Did they want to come and participate in our growing range of groups and services? And then a really cool feature of our program was that recognizing how disruptive moves across the system of care can be, our program, our staff could stay partnered and collaborating with those young people. So if they were to be discharged from a residential program into the community and were maybe starting over at a new program, getting outpatient services while starting at a new school, while getting used to a new environment, maybe new foster parents, new providers, right? Everything would change, but that we had the capacity to be a constant, right? To stick with those young people. And that even if they disconnected from us for a little while as they were getting acclimated, kind of one of our mottos was that once you're part of Bridging the Gap, you're always a part of Bridging the Gap. You're always welcome to come back, right? So we were envisioning like, wow, this could be so many things, so excited, so amped. meeting with Michelle and like having all of these big ideas. And then we started to do the work. And so this is where we found ourselves. And so you'll see this is a bit of a desert, right? You know, and I want to say, in kind of telling this story again, I want to be authentic and real about what our experience was like, and hopefully name things that maybe you are experiencing as you're doing this work, right? And hopefully will feel validating for you. And at the same time, I also just want to acknowledge, like, this kind of desert is, again, not specific to peer work, to young adult peer mentorship, right? This kind of feels like, you know, what it feels like to do more with less, which seems to be an ongoing, persistent motto in our work, right? That rarely and often, although again, lessons learned around developing these grants, we often kind of plan and build and envision under ideal circumstances, and rarely are we operating in ideal, kind of fully staffed, fully resourced circumstances. That is just not the reality of doing the work. And so I just want to name that and acknowledge that this is, you know, kind of my effort to show what it felt like and just being authentic about that experience. So, you know, as I mentioned, there were plans, there was infrastructure, things like a peer staff in-service training track that existed in our agency, some initiative, or there had been a peer work group and plan that had been developed to advance this work in the agency, and really this was an opportunity to build on that. And again, over the course of time, not all of those things were consistently available to us. So just not, you know, always having access to the resources that we needed. I think, you know, partnering across multiple programs is really challenging. So even those programs having informed consent about participation, right? A leader might have made that decision, but it didn't get communicated down so effectively, and then staff turned over. And so we were, from the beginning and throughout the life of the project, we were always kind of in a space of educating and re-educating and awareness building and relationship repair and rebuilding. You know, there are a lot of initiatives going on in a large agency at any point in time. And so how do we prioritize? That was really challenging, to just enlist the participation and collaboration of others. And I think there was, I think one of the early things that we found also, kind of from an organizational infrastructure perspective, was just confusion about policies and practices related to things like hiring. Could you hire a client of another program in the agency to work in our program? Could we hire a former client? Can we offer incentives for participation in focus groups, right? All of these kinds of questions that came up that got, you know, depending on who I asked, got different answers. And I think one of the things that I learned was, again, to kind of question, is this a policy, or is this institutional memory? Can you show me where that's written? Do we have a policy, right? We found a lot of inconsistencies in the ways that, you know, that things were practiced. And so it just kind of, again, like that desert effect. And then, you know, as this was happening, we were rolling out the program. We started to cultivate and develop services. We started to hire and staff and train our team and prepare to offer services. And as we were doing this, these kind of flaming meteors, right? As we were getting to know programs and staff and clients and sharing who we were and what we did, again, we found that folks had widely different ideas about what being a peer meant. The ways that, you know, how do we take control of the narrative and how we introduce ourselves and share who we are? You know, we cannot control the way that people receive that information, but we got really good at, like, refining the way that we offered that, the way that we described who we are and what we did. And at the same time, there was a lot of kind of questioning, a lot of comments, you know, microaggressions, both related to just the notion of peerness and kind of expectations and assumptions that people had. And again, the type of work that we did, we were the type of kind of way we defined lived experience and living experience for our program was inclusive of having mental health struggles, but that was not the be all end all. Primarily, we were working with young people who were in the foster care system, had a lot of disrupted and challenging family relationships, who had experienced trauma, were experiencing trauma, had been sex trafficked, had experienced homelessness or housing insecurity. And so those were the range of lived expertise that our team was bringing. And we, again, did our best to kind of explain that and share that. But there were still a lot of assumptions and misperceptions. And I think what this really, for me, kind of the way that I would kind of summarize or capture this is that, our agency was not one that was designed to hold living experience, right? There were a lot of challenges around things like staffing, onboarding, training, sustaining folks in their employment. And I think while there was value attributed to lived experience, there was still a very kind of narrow view of what that value was and how it could be utilized. And part of our work was to shift and educate and expand that in the agency. And so I just want to share some examples, right, of some of the things that came our way, some of these flaming meteors that came toward us throughout the course of the program. And I really tried to capture things that were coming kind of from a larger organizational level, but I also want to be very real and say that, and this is my perspective as a program developer and program director. But, at some point, if we do a follow-up webinar that includes, for example, members of my team, I'm absolutely sure that I was a flaming meteor for some of them. At any given point, right? Like we're kind of talking about this as an organizational standpoint, but this was also me sometimes. And I want to be really real and honest about that. But just to illustrate kind of some of the examples, there was, I think, a squeeze during this time to be kind of a role model program. We got shouted out and recognized a lot. And that was really lovely to have that support and recognition. And also, again, there were some very specific ways in which and kind of expectations associated with that. So one of them, could someone from your team tell their story of struggle for 200 of our closest board members and donors, right? Wanting our peer staff or having an expectation that they would just kind of tell their story and tell their story in a particular way that was dictated by someone from outside versus the way that they wanted to tell their story to achieve a particular effect. Was really disempowering and something that I feel really strongly in my role as a leader to be really clear about that, but also, again, to enlist our team in how we wanted to address that collectively and moving forward. I think also structurally, organizationally, the value that is placed on degrees. And having letters that we really advocated to increase wages, to be living wages for our team. And we could only go so far because services, things could not be billed unless somebody held a particular degree. And that was really limiting for us. A lot of questioning around, why are you supervising this way? Why don't you just write that person up? A lot of kind of status quo way of doing things that felt very rigid. And again, that didn't feel like it was acknowledging we've hired folks specifically because they are holding this lived and living expertise. And then we're actually not allowing them to live. We're placing like restrictions and expectations that don't acknowledge that, don't account for that. And so having to push back and live in that kind of flexible gray area around accommodating and trying to shift policy. And also questions about like, why aren't we meeting our deliverables, right? Not really recognizing, and we tried our best and we often did. But again, so much of this work is in relation to others, is in collaboration and partnership with different programs and provider staff. And while we did a lot of educating and awareness building around peerness, around our program and what we did and what we didn't do, we couldn't reach everyone. That was too much of a burden for any one of us or for a small program to carry. So as you know, again, like maybe I haven't looked at the chat yet because I'm rambling, but I'm seeing, okay, some endorsing. And I want to, as I'm talking about this, Vanessa, you want to add, you're good? Okay.
Yeah, I just want to say I've got the chat going. People are really feeling you.
All right. I was going to say, like, I'm going to invite folks, if there are, if you want to share some of your flaming meteors, like in the chat, by all means, right? What are some, I'm picking a couple of examples that felt like things that were happening across the system, across the organization, and repeatedly that we experienced that made, mind you, we're running a program day to day across, starting with 3 different programs that we served, and ultimately 6 programs across New York, the boroughs of New York City and Westchester County, in this mobile support kind of way. So we're running our program and also having to put a lot of energy into kind of, like fending off and supporting each other and pausing and repairing and healing, all the while kind of delivering day-to-day services. And so we recognize we've got to put some stuff into place because we're getting burned. And so, these are some of the strategies, some of the things that were through our experience that were really helpful. And we're going to break some of these down in a little bit more detail. But definitely multi-pronged supervision and support. We're going to talk a lot about the role of a supervisor of peers is also a challenging role to hold. And again, not one that in my experience was really fully held or understood in an organizational context. I had not been trained to do that work. I had to learn as I was going. And so it really can't be on one individual. And of course you want to invite in as many, expand that sphere of influence and invite in multiple perspectives. And so we, offered individual supervision, but also group supervision and coaching, and a lot of different ways for folks to learn and be supported, recognizing that, there are going to be moments of tension in any supervisory relationship, and having someone else to go to or people to go to and bounce ideas off of really benefited everyone. We also did some work over time to amend job titles. And that a lot of that was, and I don't know that we ended in a perfect place. And I think it was really a process that was specific to our program, the type of work that we did, the type of experiences that our youth and our peer mentors had. But we started with a title of peer support specialist, which was one that existed in our agency already. And again, we found that there were a lot of assumptions and expectations around what that meant that did not feel like a right fit for our team. We also recognized that we had a lot of team members who were interested and are pursuing work in the mental health field, moving forward with it. And that as they move forward, that they, and we're putting their resume or CV out there, that that having a peer title might be limiting to them. Might be like exclude them from future opportunities that they were absolutely right for and deserving of. And so we amended our job title to youth development specialist, because our team, and that was a collaborative process, because that felt like it described the work that they did and their relationship to young people. And we actually we had this kind of what was jokingly a senior peer, and we, who had been there longer and was also supporting and mentoring and coaching our newer peer staff. And so we actually, we were like, great, we do have a senior peer role. And so we created a new job title with salary to match. And that senior peer kind of became legitimized as a youth development coach. We continue to persist and try to shift the organizational, help the organization to be more ready and to kind of recognize where more support was needed. I will highlight some of the key relationships that we built were with facilities. folks who worked in the buildings and like could give us access, especially as we were a mobile team, but building those relationships were really important with human resources to help them understand the type of experience that we were looking for, and also to kind of question. That was an area where there was a lack of clarity around policies and kind of a status quo way of thinking that we tried to shake up a little bit. With fiscal around some of the hiring and salaries, and just generally like a lot of managing up when we got requests from leadership to kind of help reframe and to bring a more recovery-oriented perspective. We also offered a lot of professional development for our all of our staff, but in particular, resources for supervisors, mentorship, coaching, space to get support around some of the challenges. And just, I think for our program, just a culture of mutual support and learning spaces. Really how to, we made that a part of our program culture, focused, I think, one of the ways that we talked about our program was that we all held expertise, and that there wasn't an expectation that any one team member knew all of the things. That was never going to be, but that collectively, all of us coming together held our held little bits of expertise, and together that's what made our program strong, and that we were always going to be engaged in ongoing learning. And that helped us to kind of normalize that we were going to make mistakes, that we were going to make stumbles, that we could name them, own them, and learn from them. And that was something that we were all engaged in. That was my work to do as a program director, as a supervisor, not just work for our team. And so that, as we started to do that work, it felt like we had this like protective bubble that we were spinning around us that started to shield us a bit from the flaming meteors, or how we learned to expect them, and we knew what to do. We did a lot of collective problem solving together. And I will say what helped us along this path was to really stay connected to our goals as a program. Who are we here for? Why are we doing this? Creating core values. And so when we struggled, which we did, we came back to those core values. Knowing who we were there for, why we were doing this, was really important in keeping us going. And we also found that we weren't alone. I met Vanessa very early on. Her name and her peer supervision manual came to us early on from like 3 different sources within a 2-week period. And it was so heartening to know that there were that this work was happening in other places, that we weren't alone. And frankly, this was an opportunity for us to be validated, because often the messages that we were receiving when we were experiencing these challenges was that it was our misperception, right? That we just weren't thinking correctly, or we were being too sensitive, or we weren't appreciating the way things were. And it was really incredibly validating to have other folks who were going through similar processes, and again, like being able to share that expertise. And so the bubble expanded, and we started to bring more people in, right? And that strengthened us. It gave us a lot of support. It created, I think, a space where we were practicing mutuality and peerness and peer support, and kind of redefining that. And that looked different for all of us in our various roles. But it's also a place where we could really come together and name some of those forms of oppression that were impacting us, and share strategies for addressing that. And so this is where I'll end our story. We never got quite here, but this is kind of what I envision as our ideal future, where we no longer need the bubble, where we're in a much more kind of lush, hydrated, clear skied, lots of vegetation, right? We're able to, we're no longer in the desert. We're no longer putting all of that energy into building that bubble force field. And we're actually able to take that energy and put it into, invest that into the environment, right? I think about all of the energy that went into kind of problem solving, and what we could have done, what we could have accomplished if we had been able to use that energy toward growth and learning and development. So I'll end my little narrative here with us in this beautiful, lush space.
I love this. And I think it all comes back to the organization. So I think that what we have collectively learned is you can train young people to be fantastic peer support providers, peer mentors. Context matters. It matters so much for a lot of reasons. And now we're going to shift and share some tools and practices and philosophies and approaches that y'all can use in real time right now. So here is a fantastic resource I developed with wonderful people in Massachusetts. Allie Gold, I know you're on here. Thank you for your partnership in this. This is a toolkit that is for an organization. It's called the Young Adult Peer Mentoring Organizational Self-Assessment and Capacity Building Toolkit. My God, that's a mouthful. However, it is designed for an organization. So I'm going to say a group of key decision makers within an organization to take a look at this and ask themselves some questions about the setting. And is the setting going to help young people in peer roles thrive? Because the setting matters. So it's not just also the setting, and a couple people mentioned this in the chat, it is also an implementation plan. So this toolkit is rooted in implementation science, and this idea is that you have to change some of the leadership and some of the systems and the processes if you're going to integrate, I'll say, any new system or practice or service line. Same goes for young people in peer roles. And so you really do need facilitators. So you need resources, commitment, and champions. That's really, really important. And you need a strategic plan. So you don't go about just being like, we're going to hire some people, because this is what, oh my God, so many of my projects, let's just hire, let's just start. BTG is a good example. Let's just go. We're going to hire, figure it out as we go. And that is really, really beautiful. But in that process, and I'm going to speak from my perspective, I have seen harm. I have experienced harm. I have seen trauma. I have experienced trauma. I think a lot of things could have been, from what we have learned, we're providing these tools so that some of these things can be avoided. I cannot tell you the importance of having a team of people who's monitoring the implementation of, or the integration of young people in peer roles. Second thing I want to mention is do not underestimate, and I know a few people in here, we've had a little bit of clinician chatter of the non-peer clinically trained staff kind of not getting the role. So really, you have to put first that we have to educate, re-educate. The turnover is so high in all these positions right now. So make no assumptions about any of your staff joining your community mental health setting in their understanding of what peer support is. I just was talking to someone yesterday, they're like, yeah, I'm trying to explain to my friend what peer support is. I don't even know how to say it. Right, it is complex. So really, we've got to, even within our community mental health care system, we have to have our non-peer clinicians need to know what it is, know the value. And so I want to just big shout out, that is, if you go visit this Mass DMH's Children's Behavioral Health Knowledge Center website, there are some videos in the media center that you will be able to see they're about 10 to 15 minutes, they're mini trainings, and they're geared towards non-peer staff. So your residential staff who are not trained in peer support, your clinicians, your vocational specialists, your rec people, your leaders, have them take a look at this. Your psychiatrists, your prescribers. That media library has a lot of specifically designed tools for non-peer, because you need those collaborators and those partners to value the role, or more harm will happen. Next slide. Which I think is Antonia's. Okay.
This is me. So I'm going to give a plug, a shout out to the Bridging the Gap Peer Kit that Vanessa, Michelle, and many others who did this work together contributed. It's kind of a collection, a summary of a lot of the different tools and resources that we developed through the life of this project to take, really building on the manual that Vanessa shared and the work that existed, and how to operationalize that and utilize it in the context of the organization that we were practicing in. Like, what does that look like for BTG? And so in that, we talk about this young adult peer support provider kind of supervision model, which is a 4-part model. So one, individual supervision that is really primarily the crux of that is building a trusting relationship between the peer staff member and their supervisor. It also includes checking in around tasks, but really I thought a lot about how do we make it super clear ensure that our staff have a really clear understanding of their role, their responsibilities, and that they have the support and the tools that they need in order to be effective in that job, so that we're not setting folks up to do something that is like diffuse and then punishing them when they're not able to meet those objectives. We also offered group supervision that was a supplement to individual. And again, it was frankly a time saver. It was efficient. So when there are things, information that needed to be communicated out or planned across multiple staff members, it made sense to do that together. It became a place to like brainstorm and bounce ideas off of each other, but also with like mutual learning and information sharing, right? Folks learn and process and hold on to things in different ways. And so it was a place for some collective problem solving and planning. We also developed what we called, and I have to give credit to one of our team members, Patrick, who just had a knack for naming things. Peers for Peers, or PFP, was a space turned into kind of like a monthly gathering of peers. And I think what was really important about that, it was a space where our peer staff set the agenda. It was not my agenda. Like my job actually as an administrator was to ensure, and with all of these factors, that doing this work, having the space to be in an individual supervision and group supervision and peers for peers and attending training, that I created a program structure that allowed time, space, and energy for these things to happen. That it wasn't an add-on or an extra or make it happen during your lunch break, but really prioritized as a valuable part of their work responsibilities. And so the cool thing about this was, our staff set the agenda, they identified the priorities and the topics, and then when I came in, and I did this alongside a member of our training team who also came with lived experience as a peer mentor and trained on recovery-oriented care, she and I would come into that space as invited guests with a clear ask or agenda. So we were there as guests to provide support and then step out. And then finally, ongoing training. So for a period of time, we actually had a really cool in-service peer mentorship training track that existed. And over time, we also kind of developed our own kind of Bridging the Gap BTG brand of that, that was focused on really supplementing the agency training that existed. And again, making sense of it in terms of how it relates to folks' jobs. And it was, I will say also, I think something that made this different from kind of the typical agency training was that it was fun. It was really activity oriented. We learned a lot through partnering with Vanessa and her team around how to really liven up our training experiences to make them more palatable, but also like just engaging and folks wanting to participate in that. So that's another thing I wanted to highlight. And then I think we can't underscore the importance of professional and emotional support. I think this, it's a note that it's the number one most requested support from youth and young adult peers. It's what folks wanted. It's what was asked for and prioritized. I feel some sadness that what we created in Bridging the Gap was, I think we were on the verge of expanding that across the agency when the pandemic started. And of course, the pandemic radically shifted all aspects of the work that we do. But I can't underscore the importance of having space free from supervisors, free from administrators, like not being scared about what's going to be said in the room and feeling like you need to monitor that or police it, but just allowing folks to be. It was so critically important to our staff and to the other peer staff that worked in the agency that really wanted to be a part of that group and share in that space as well. We were a peer program, but so many peers are working in the context of programs where they are the only or one of few, are very isolated in those experiences. And when we're isolated in our experiences, we accept the status quo for what it is. We can't, we're cut off from learning what peer mentorship could look like, could be when we're only doing it in the context of the program, particularly when no one else in the program has held that role or holds that role. It's really limiting. And so again, these are things that should be, I'm advising very strongly to bake this into your programming, to resource this, to prioritize this. We talk about turnover in the field. I had members of my team who were there for almost the entire life of the project. I had a team member who worked their way up and was with our project for 4.5 years. I had team members who experienced homelessness during the course of their employment, and we were able to hold and keep them connected through rough spots as they were living, having these moments of struggle. And I think that having this space and prioritizing it was a big part of how we were able to do that together. Okay, and I think this is another one where we're each there's a lot to say here. And so we'll pass it along. I'll get us started and then pass to you, Vanessa, for any comments. I learned a lot. I learned a lot through this project. I'm still learning. And I really want to encourage folks to be open to all the possibilities of peerness, and to really, think about what your program is trying to accomplish and who you serve and what peerness means for you, to move away from a narrow view of that, and to create space where people can bring their whole selves. And again, that's something I think that we're all deserving of. That, to me, we're learning a lot from peers, but that is something for all of us. We are better when we can be our full selves, when we are not having to give energy toward hiding, limiting, making decisions about what to share. I think a way that I came into that is, what it means, for example, to be a queer person, to be openly queer in this field and to talk about that, right? That's hiding that. I'm not doing my best work when I'm scared or worried about limiting that. And that was a way that I connected to that. We are all deserving of safety and the right of being our fullest selves in this work. I'll pass it to you, Vanessa.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate the unfortunate assumptions about peer support that just really still exist right now, that so many people, even just this last week, I don't know anything about you. I don't even know your story. What's your diagnosis? There's so much more. And these basic, what you see in these little green boxes, this is what peerness is. This is what peer support, this is what we should be putting forth and leading with. And so I just wanted to reiterate the stepping away from the diagnosis and the recovery journey story and all. It's all very, very important. But then there's these other bigger picture things about what it feels like to just be with someone who just gets you and gets your uniqueness and finds it lovely, right? And you just feel like you belong. Michelle.
Okay, so I'm going to just, in the interest of time, say go to the next slide. I concur with everything said on this slide. And you can forward again a couple of times. So I think a lot of folks were putting in the chat, a few people anyway, sort of how they're in the position to begin a peer program, or they've been hired as a peer. And this field is growing, right? It's growing nationally, it's growing globally, right? And sometimes leaders and organizations have the best of intentions, but they don't know all of this information. They don't know all about what Vanessa and Antonia and I have been speaking about. And so there can be real challenges. And so a couple of the things we wanted to just reiterate here about increasing safety and support, right, is this notion that they're part of taking the role of peer. You're stepping into, right, what is considered a stigmatized identity. And so what are some of the things that we can do to make that a more positive experience? And some of the things have been touched upon, but just to reiterate them, it's really important for program leaders, supervisors, right, within program and within the organization to be that voice and support that peers don't have to disclose on demand or at the board meeting, or, really putting in safeguards that people aren't exploited in those ways. Also helping encourage organizations and leadership that actually all folks in an organization can share and can be talking about their lived and living experience, not just folks in peer roles. And then on the increasing safety and support side, right, Antonia gave the great experience about even changing the job title and how that manifested in the organization and people's response to the youth development specialists. And then this idea of thinking about and supporting and really taking great care with setting up supports for strategic sharing and thinking about ways to help folks to share parts of their lived experience, right? And share in what can be a strategic and supportive way. Next slide.
Okay, so this is just so critical, and I know many of us work in organizational contexts that put recovery first and wellness first, but to really put it first for everyone, that is critical for integrating peer staff effectively, and I would argue any staff effectively. It's really important, though, it's part of the language, the culture, and that we all, especially the supervisors and program managers, are recognizing the problematic narratives that really do exist. We're asking people, young people in peer roles, to share their lived and living experience, right? What they're going through, but then we're also expecting them to be well all of the time. And how can those two things be true if we don't have supports in place to help those things be true? Critical. And so what Antonia named with the BTG supports that were put in place, I cannot underscore that peer-for-peer space, that space, very important to have mutual support happening within your organization or across organizations, right? If you don't have too many peers at one org, find young people in peer roles down the road, another org. And also, I think that this thing about, we want people to talk about their past experiences and what they've been through and what they've recovered from, this notion of you've recovered, but not talk about what you're struggling with now. Let's just, reconciling that, it's really hard during the transition to adulthood when there's a lot of stress and a lot of change all the time. Really hard to do. So if you're supervising your program manager, you have to embrace, I'm going to argue that the transition to adulthood, there's that developmental instability, but also this idea that like mental health struggles are going to arise for all of your staff. Welcome to community mental health care. But also they're going to arise for young people in peer roles too. And you just have to accept that as part of the work, right? In recognizing that and having supports in place. Next slide. And really quickly, I just want to add one quick thing about supervisors needing training and support too. I cannot emphasize the importance. This role is really critical. It's really important. There's a supervisor guide. Again, it's not perfect, disclaimer, but it has some exercises in it that you can incorporate in individual supervision and in group supervision that are reflective, that incorporate strategic sharing. So check out this guide to help you become a better supervisor and recognize that you are actually an advocate for change within your organization. You're not just helping develop your peer support providers on your team. You are changing your org as a supervisor. And next slide, Michelle.
Yes, and just piggybacking on that, I think it's just an opportunity again to say that this is a movement, right? And I feel honored, and I know Antonia and Vanessa feel honored to be part of that movement and just to recognize so many youth and young people who are leading us in this movement, right? And as we started out with, we really are putting forth our lessons learned, things that went well, challenges, right? But a lot of the things and a lot of the work that all of you are doing, globally in this call is amazing, and you're change makers. And we can continue to do this work and ask these critical questions where there's tensions and try to figure out how to do this best in each of our different contexts. So be a change maker, be in the movement, join us. Next slide. Yeah, I think these were just some of the questions we wanted to, I know we have about 5 minutes. If people wanted to put into the chat right? In reflecting on this webinar and all this content, what is something that you might be able to integrate into your own program, your own practice?
We just got a great comment from Jace. I just want to say thank you for that on the basics of getting started and where do you start. And I definitely want to suggest like connecting with Antonia on like the basics of like how, because within the BTG guidebook, actually definitely check out that kit. We call it the kit. It has within it job descriptions and all the different things you have to do to get a youth peer support program up and running. Thank you, Jace, for saying that's a need, because I know that that could be a future webinar too that we could talk about, of just some of the nuts and bolts of getting a program off the ground. It definitely starts with having, I would say, a team, a steering committee, for lack of a better, God, we got to come up with better words, but a steering committee that's cross-departmental that gets together and talks about why up here, why are we doing this? And for who are we doing this for, and really starts to define who is the target population and what is the vision, and then it's getting together and figuring out what are the nuts and bolts, and we could definitely talk to you about that for sure. Other questions?
Also add, like a lot of the logistics and legalities vary from state to state, right? The rules around what is reimbursable, it's often very localized. And so again, navigate, and I will say even what is available often is a little muddy, is a little unclear. That's part of the challenge of doing this work, is that there's not a lot of like centralized repository of like, here's how you roll out the program in the context of your state, your location. So having that infrastructural like and leadership support and understanding and doing some of that organizational readiness work is super important to really determine like, what does this mean for us? And then going from there, and like, who can we enlist for support in our community? Where is their expertise? Building relationships with other peer organizations. And yes, I'm always happy to chat more about it.
Other questions? I wonder, Emily and Dee, were there any questions in the Q&A?
No, we haven't had any questions through the Q&A. Jace replied, I think, in the chat. And then I don't know, Linda, Lewin Roy, if you have a question, you've had your hand raised for a long time, I know. And then it looks like Tammy just put something in the chat. Oh, yes. The slides will be available. The recording of the webinar will be available on the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research's website. Yes, you can link to us for sure once it's live on our website. And we will send an email to everyone who registered that the slides and webinar are available.
Yeah, I want to reiterate that in different states, there are different youth peer, like, so Ohio people that are on the call, in Ohio just launched a youth peer certification, I think in April. So the different states are in different phases of integrating youth and young adult peer roles within child systems. There's also some trickiness where there's some programs that bridge or span both child and adult systems, also complicated. And then some are on the adult side that are serving like a young adult population. And as Antonia said, the billing mechanisms are all very different, the rules around Medicaid. And there are some interesting, I would say, foundation and donor funded peer run programs across the country. I really think I'm really glad I thought of that in the moment, like going and being in a peer run program and finding out how people do it. And like, that is how I've learned, to be honest, is talking to people doing this work all over. And I cannot emphasize finding out who is closest geographically and going to, as COVID allows. Oh, Emma, interesting. Peer supports, yeah, there's this stigma, like when young people are moving. I've also gotten a lot of my colleagues, mental health professionals, around email etiquette. We created a 2-pager on email etiquette because some of our colleagues were like, what is wrong with this new staff? Like, they don't know, they just acting, that's how, you know, and it's like, well, who gets trained in how to write an email? No one. So anyways, but just really like there is, you know, negative views of moving a lot, right? That older people are more stable in their lives. And it's actually very normative, developmentally normative to change living situation a lot in your early 20s. So, you know, but it's true. I mean, that is, I would argue, an ageism thing that you're mentioning. You can remind people, hey, that's actually normal now. Normal thing. I don't like the word normal, but it's typical thing. Oh, Emma asking about the high-level supervisor. Antonia or Michelle, do you want to weigh in? You know,
I mean, I will say a lot. For me, this work is so much about relationship building and rebuilding. And I developed a lot of calling in and calling out skills and discerning when to use what. And so one of my approaches is just to pull folks aside and say, hey, like, I noticed you, or, you know, observed this, and can you tell me a little bit more about where you're coming from? So like really I do a lot of like, I'm a big motivational interviewing person. So like, let me motivate what you might be, or validate what you might be feeling. And then like, would you be open to hearing a little bit more? And so I kind of talk with people, and I think that's also where having being clear about our values and goals was like, that's an area of mutuality with just so many people that I'm working in my organization. Like we're all, you know, for the most part, there from a place of good intent and wanting the best for the youth, families, individuals that we serve. And so kind of reframing something is like, how is that actually moving? How is this moving us toward our goal or our shared value? Like, you know, like trying to build some empathy and understanding, but really kind of trying to broaden that out a little bit, because I think that's a part of like that culture shift work, right? I want to alleviate the stress in that particular situation, but also if I can, like leave that person reflecting on how maybe that's not a helpful attitude to bring to the work.
And I would just add to that, trying to evolve spaces where those supervisors are actually part of team meetings with peers, and there's relationship building going on so that they're getting to know one another and one another's strengths. So just adding that to the conversation.
I know that we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to add that when you create tools around like how to best communicate, it's really tricky because who determines what is the best way to communicate? What is the etiquette supposed to be? And it becomes really tricky because we're defining it based on what the system looks like now and what's in practice now, and helping our staff, our young people, to adhere to that. We're gonna help you fit into that system. And I have lots of young people who are like, I think you guys are ridiculous. I think these emails are too long. I think so. We've had lots of going back and forth on like communication styles via texting and email, and just how your younger staff are communicating in different ways, and that we have to be open to changing, right? So the system and the provider and the communication, I'll say the culture around communication needs to also shift. So as I share that tool, I want to also disclaimer it. I'm not saying that like the only way to communicate is like the way of like, I'm going to say it very like, and who determines what professionalism is. My God, we could have unpacked that today too. So just want to say disclaimer on that, but we found it very useful. Thank you guys. Thank you for your time today. Oh, there's more questions. Do we keep answering? Do we keep going?
1:33 p.m. and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Kevin, could they answer via email for that? Just because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I want to thank Vanessa, Antonia, and Michelle for this. Yes, the slides will be posted on our website for this really awesome presentation and your time. I want to thank everyone who attended, and the slides and recording will be available on our website, and we'll send out an email, and we'll include all of the links as well. And further questions can be directed to the presenters. Thank you everyone so much. Take care.